In Spanish, when you talk about yourself with an adjective or a noun, you often have to choose between the o or the a form, depending on your masculine or feminine gender. Estoy cansado, estoy cansada. But what if there was a third option? That's what the Spanish-speaking world is still trying to figure out, and that's what we're talking about today here at Jive World. So imagine this, right? You're with a group of Spanish-speaking friends. All of you are girls except for one guy. You want to address the whole group and say, hey guys, let's take a picture. What do you say? Chicos or chicas? Well, in Spanish, the grammatical rule goes that in a group, even if the majority of the people or things in the group are feminine, even if there's just one masculine person or thing, it's all referred to in the masculine. So by Spanish's rules, even in that group of almost all girls, just because there's one guy, you would refer to everyone as chicos, or guys, literally. Isn't that interesting? We're talking about this today because in the last few years, there's been a growing conversation around grammatical gender in Spanish and the larger social and political impact that it has on society. Some people argue that gendered language reinforces gender stereotypes, and others argue that gendered language excludes trans identities. So because of these concerns, some Spanish speakers have begun to adopt what's called lenguaje inclusivo, or inclusive language. According to the UN, lenguaje inclusivo is a form of expressing oneself in speech and writing without discriminating against anyone's sex or gender and without reinforcing gender stereotypes. But what does lenguaje inclusivo look like in Spanish? Well, we talked about endings earlier, endings on nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, and this is what most people think of when they think of lenguaje inclusivo. Gender-neutral suffixes, and there's a couple of different suffixes that you could use. So instead of a word ending in o or a, it could end in I, X, or even the @ sign. So for example, with I, chicos becomes chiques. Chiques, ¿quieren algo de tomar? You could also see it written the other ways that I mentioned, but these two are losing traction, and it's likely because people aren't sure how to pronounce them. Listen to this soundbite from our story, En Busca de las Palabras. In this story, the narrator Micah is trans and trying to navigate lenguaje inclusivo before it was even officially a thing.
Es muy difícil hablar sin decir estoy cansado, estoy cansada. Como dices tengo cansancio. Y entonces ya suena muy raro. Y todo el tiempo estás pensando cómo digo esto, cómo digo el otro.
Y entonces se vuelve agotador hablar en español. Maika, al principio de su transición, lo solucionaba así.
No decía el final de las palabras, no decía estoy cansado. Entonces te oyes como que no sabes hablar o algo. O hablaba en inglés y en vez de decir el verbo estoy cansado o cansada, decía estoy muy tired.
So anyways, hijes instead of hijos to mean children, les instead of los to mean the plural the, and there's even a third person gender neutral pronoun now, which is ella. So it's no longer just él or ella anymore, there's also ella. Now another more subtle way to use the lenguaje inclusivo in Spanish is to exclude pronouns altogether. So instead of saying él puede, you just say puede. And in fact, this is something that Spanish already does. And it makes perfect grammatical sense because you can tell who's doing an action in Spanish even without the pronoun and just looking at the verb. So unlike English, where different pronouns often use the same verb, like I do, you do, they do, we do, Spanish has a different verb for each pronoun. Yo hago, tú haces, él hace, nosotros hacemos. The person is attached to the verb essentially, so you don't have to constantly use the pronoun to point out who's doing what. One situation where people encourage leaving out the pronoun altogether, for example, is when you meet someone and you're not sure how they identify or what pronouns they use. Now, aside from altering their words, another way that you might see lenguaje inclusivo is people using different words and speaking more generally. So instead of saying, for example, estamos cansados, which is the masculine plural, you could say tenemos cansancio or tenemos sueño. So you're avoiding describing with an adjective, estar cansado, and instead you're using a phrase with tener, to have, and saying that essentially everyone has fatigue. Or also, instead of saying los gerentes to mean the managers, you could just say management, la gerencia. So you're not referring to people and their gender specifically, you're just referring to the team or the entity, la gerencia. So now we've talked about what lenguaje inclusivo is, but what do people actually think about it? Well, in Spanish-speaking circles, it's often still under a lot of debate, and it's pretty much a hot-button issue. Some support using lenguaje inclusivo because of the initiatives that I mentioned earlier, so being more gender-inclusive to women and also including trans people. Sexism or machismo is a very relevant topic in Latin America, and this effort seems to correlate with that. And some people are against it, saying that it's a destruction of the Spanish language, that it's incorrect, or even that it's just bad Spanish. There was actually a headline this time last year that a teacher had failed a student because they had written their assignment in inclusive language. And some people are kind of in the middle. They don't use lenguaje inclusivo not because they're against it, but because they think that there are more important or significant actions to take than changing their language. But what does the RAE have to say about all of this? So for those of you that don't know, the Real Academia Española is Spain's official institution that safeguards the correct usage of the Spanish language. It's basically the entity that decides if certain words are part of Spanish or not. In short, the answer to incorporating lenguaje inclusivo as official Spanish has been not now. In fact, the director of the RE, Santiago Muñoz Machado, has said that it's society that decides how the language evolves, not institutions. So they're not going to recognize lenguaje inclusivo and all of its adaptations officially, like miembras, chiques, ella, unless it catches on in a more widespread fashion first. They have incorporated alternate, more gender-inclusive language before, like for example, presidente, presidenta. So that's an example of a word that caught on and became part of the dictionary just from use. So now, the question, lenguaje inclusivo, to use or not to use? Well, we can't tell you because there's no right answer. It's still a relatively new topic, and the ongoing debate has been so controversial because it's not just a linguistic issue, it's also social and political. So there's implications much larger than language here. What we can say is, do whatever feels right to you. A lot of people decide to use lenguaje inclusivo or not based on their social circles. But this is what's so fun about learning Spanish, right? You get a front seat to all of the changes and evolutions that are happening in real time, whether that's on a large or a small scale. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with a friend who might find this interesting. Happy listening and stay job fluent. See ya.